There's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. What happens to our character when we're under pressure? And by character, I don't mean whether you're a good or bad person. I mean the values you refuse to negotiate under pressure. Because most of us know who we want to be. We know the kind of leader we want to be. We know how we want to treat people. We know that we want to be curious, objective, humble, accountable, courageous. But knowing your values and being able to access those values when you feel threatened are two completely different things. Pressure has a way of revealing that gap. It reveals the difference between the character we believe we have and the character we've practiced enough access when we're scared, embarrassed, challenged, ignored, uncertain, or losing control. And I was reminded of this past week in a way that I don't particularly enjoy at all. Welcome back to Holding the Room. I'm Melissa Sierra, a certified business and leadership coach, and I help high achievers turn pressure, disruption, and uncertainty into greater clarity, stronger leadership, and more opportunity. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here before, thanks for joining again. So let's talk about my story when a technical problem became an identity problem. Last Sunday, I recorded an episode of this podcast that I absolutely loved. It was timely and I felt passionate about the topic. I walked away from that recording feeling really good about it. Everything was checked, everything looked right. Riverside distributed the episode to the podcast platforms on Monday. And then Monday afternoon, an industry colleague messaged me. There was no audio, nothing. And I was completely floored. I had checked everything before I let it be distributed. So immediately, I went into what I know how to do really well, and that is fix it. I didn't contact Riverside. I didn't stop and ask who actually has the best information to solve this. I Googled it because my instinct has always been to figure things out myself. And that instinct has served me incredibly well throughout my career. It made me resilient. It made me resourceful. And frankly, I think it's part of what has given me substance as a practitioner as well as a thought leader. I don't just want to talk about things, I want to understand how they work. So I found what I thought was the answer. I unpublished the original episode and uploaded it again, except there were two problems. Google hadn't told me that removing an episode from podcast platforms can take time, and uploading it again also didn't fix the audio. So now, instead of one broken episode, I had created what looked like duplicate episodes on purpose, neither solving my actual problem. And that's when something changed because this stopped being there's a technical problem with my podcast and it became what does this say about me? I felt shame, embarrassment. I felt like a fraud. And I said to myself, this makes me look like an amateur. Maybe I'm not as good as I think. People are going to think I don't know what I'm doing. Think about that leap I had just made. A piece of technology simply wasn't working. But somehow my brain had turned that into a referendum on my entire identity. I think high achievers do something under pressure that we don't talk about enough. And I call it threat stacking. One thing happens, but we don't respond to just that one thing. We rapidly attach 4 to 5 additional threats to it. The audio doesn't work becomes my reputation is at risk. My credibility is at risk. My competence is at risk. This thing that I'm building is at risk. Maybe everything I've accomplished isn't as substantial as I thought it was. One event, 5 perceived threats. And now you're no longer responding to reality. You're responding to a catastrophic story you've built around reality. Fight or flight isn't resolved for someone chasing you through the woods. It can happen to you in a boardroom. It can happen when you receive an email. It can happen when you miss a KPI. It can happen when someone questions your decision. It can happen when revenue drops. It can happen when a launch doesn't perform. And apparently, it can happen when your podcast loses its audio. But here's what makes threat stacking particularly dangerous for high achievers. We don't just catastrophize the future. We rewrite the past. Suddenly, the things you've accomplished don't count quite as much. The progress you've made starts looking smaller. You begin questioning whether you were really capable in the first place. One mistake starts competing with 20 years of evidence. It's a biased performance review with a sample size of one. And somehow the one piece of negative energy gets promoted to the CEO. This isn't just an emotional internal experience. Threat stacking changes how we lead. Imagine a leader walks into a boardroom after missing a significant KPI. Objectively, the business has a problem. The number was missed, and there needs to be accountability, as well as a diagnosis and maybe even a change in strategy. But then the leader threat stacks it. We miss the number becomes my strategy is being questioned, my credibility is being questioned, my authority is being questioned, my position may be at risk. And suddenly, they're not leading the business problem anymore. They're defending themselves from an identity threat. And that's when curiosity disappears. Questions become accusations, accountability becomes blame, and people start managing up instead of telling the truth. The leader starts fighting to prove they were right rather than becoming curious about why the business was wrong. And that's how organizations start losing good people because those employees are no longer being led by the leader's character. They're being managed by the leader's fear. And that's a very different working environment. When leaders operate from fear long enough, everyone around them learns how to manage the fear. They learn which information not to bring forward. They learn when to stay quiet. They learn how to package bad news. And they learn whose ego to be protected. And now you've created something much more dangerous than a missed KPI. You've created a culture where reality has to negotiate for permission to enter that room. And that is a massive loss of leverage because the leader who needs to be accurate information has inadvertently trained everyone around them to filter it. And if you're building something on your own, threat stacking looks different. Maybe you're launching something and it's quiet. You expected 10 clients, but you got 2. You publish the video, it doesn't perform. You launch the newsletter and nobody responds. You make the offer and no one buys. Those are data points. But when you threat stack them, they become identity statements. The launch was slow becomes the offer is terrible. The business isn't working. The market doesn't want what I have to offer. I'm not cut out for this. I need to change everything. And suddenly you stop operating like a CEO and start operating like a gambler. You start making desperate pivots because you've made the market's response on a referendum of your worth. New offer, new audience, new positioning, new platform, new strategy, anything to make the uncomfortable feeling go away. And sometimes the most strategic thing you could have done was absolutely nothing for just another week to get more information. Because a CEO responds to patterns, but a gambler responds to outcomes. One bad hand cannot tell you whether the strategy works. One slow launch cannot tell you whether the business works. One piece of content cannot tell you whether your positioning works. And one broken podcast certainly cannot tell me whether I deserve to have this podcast. But survival mode hates incomplete information. It wants certainty now. So we manufacture certainty through action, even when the action reduces our leverage. Survival mode, though, distorts scale. That evening, I became obsessed with fixing the problem. I couldn't focus on anything else. I was triggered, overstimulated, spiraling, and later that night, lying in bed, I realized something that bothered me much more than the podcast problem I had. I hadn't really been present at dinner with my husband. Here was this person I love sitting across from me, living this life with me. And I had allowed one professional problem to become bigger than the entire world we were coexisting in. And that's when I started thinking about how survival mode distorts scale. Something can matter without becoming everything. But when we're in survival mode, our field of vision shrinks. We become temporarily self centric. What does this mean about me? How does this make me look? What could I lose? How do I fix it? And sometimes we mistake that obsession for responsibility. We tell ourselves, I'm just being accountable. I'm being resilient. I'm solving the problem. But sometimes fear is wearing a productivity costume. And if these are the kinds of leadership conversations you've been looking for, I just want to remind you to subscribe to Holding the Room. I think of this show as truly a leadership laboratory, not a place where we pretend what we've mastered, but a place where we examine what's happening when leaders are actually having difficult times, because that's where the interesting work begins. So let's dive deeper into the high achievers paradox. Here's where I think this becomes especially dangerous for successful people. Under pressure, we tend to overuse the strengths that have made us successful. Independence becomes isolation. Conviction becomes defensiveness. Accountability becomes self blame. Persistence becomes an inability to disengage. Resourcefulness becomes, I have to solve this myself. The strength isn't the problem. The inability to choose when to use it is. And that's what happened to me. My resourcefulness didn't suddenly become a weakness. I stopped choosing it. I defaulted to it. And there's a distinction I've been sitting with ever since. I don't want you to suppress your instinct, but I want you to suspend it long enough to choose it. Because the thriving version of me in that situation would have behaved very differently. She would have gone to Riverside directly and asked for help. Let the people who understand the platform help diagnose the platform and continue living my life while the problem was being addressed. That's not giving away power. That's actually a more leveraged position, because leverage isn't proving that you can solve everything yourself. Leverage is having enough perspective to know which problems require you and which problems require the right resource. Fight and flight don't always look like fight and flight. I've seen this same survival mechanism play out in corporate environments. I watch highly capable people enter new team dynamics where authority is changing or a new culture is being built. And suddenly, standard business operations go out the window. Managing up disappears. Timelines become optional. Accountability becomes threatening, and questions become challenges to authority. And when challenged, the person becomes defensive and starts crossing lines in an attempt to establish power they don't actually have. I've also seen other people do completely the opposite. They become quiet, they avoid, they accept anything, they disappear. Some people shout louder. Some people fight desperately to be visible rather than focusing on the actual problem. Some deflect accountability. These behaviors look completely different, but underneath them can be exactly the same motivation. Make the threat stop. Fight and flight are both attempts to manufacture safety. One tries to overpower the environment, the other tries to escape it. But both can cost you leverage, because every time the environment determines which version of your character gets to show up, you've transformed some of your power into the environment. Pressure reveals your character gap. This is where I changing about how I was thinking about this episode. I originally thought pressure made high achievers lose their character, but I don't think that's quite right. I think pressure reveals the gap between the character we believe we have and the character we've practiced enough to access when we're threatened. Because character isn't simply who you say you are. For me, character is the values you refuse to negotiate under pressure. That's the test. It's easy to be curious when nobody is questioning you. It's easy to be objective when the outcome doesn't affect you. It's easy to be humble when your credibility isn't on the line. But can you access those things when you're embarrassed, when you're scared, when you're being challenged, when you've made a mistake, when you don't know the answer, when you feel like you're losing control? That's where character gets stress test. So let's walk through the 3 pattern interrupters. I've thought about which parts of my own character I most want available to me when things get difficult. And there are 3: curiosity, objectivity, humility. But I've started thinking about them less as abstract values and more as pattern interrupters, because each interrupts a different survival story. Curiosity interrupts certainty. Survival mode loves certainty. I'm a fraud. They don't respect me. This isn't working. I'm going to fail. They're trying to undermine me. Notice how definitive those statements are. Curiosity introduces possibility. What else could be true? What information don't I have? What assumption am I making? What would someone without my emotional attachment see in this situation? Curiosity doesn't require you to believe everything is fine. It simply stops fear from becoming the only narrator. Objectivity interrupts catastrophizing. Objectivity asks, what actually happened? Not what am I afraid this means? Not what could theoretically happen 6 months from now? Not what does my insecurity tell me this proves? What are the facts? My podcast had a technical problem. That's what happened. I'm an amateur was a story. A KPI missed. That's a fact. My entire leadership strategy is failing requires consistently more evidence. Nobody wants what I'm selling is interpretation. Objectivity separates the event from the identity. Humility interrupts ego protection. Humility allows us to say, I don't know. I need help. I may have gotten this wrong. I don't have the full picture. This moment may have something to teach me without translating any of those statements into, therefore, I'm not capable. Humility is especially difficult for high achievers because competence becomes part of our identity. But needing help doesn't invalidate your competence. Sometimes competence is knowing when you're no longer the person with the best answer. And that's the lesson I missed when I went to Google instead of Riverside. I've realized that I have a very clear warning sign for when I've crossed from a healthy problem into survival mode. I start questioning my identity. I start downplaying how much I've grown. One failure suddenly outweighs years of evidence. One difficult conversation outweighs dozens of successful ones. One bad outcome outweighs every advancement I've made. One mistake becomes proof that maybe I've been fooling everyone all along. Again, it's a biased review with a sample size of one. So here's a diagnostic I want you to remember. Has this situation caused me to reconsider my entire capability based on one moment, one outcome, or one mistake? If the answer is yes, you may not need to solve harder. You may need to restore perspective before deciding what the situation actually requires. This is where I want to take the power audit one step further. Let's call it the leverage check, because fight or flight isn't only an emotional response, it can represent a transfer of power. So let's think about the last 48 hours. Where have you traded your character for the feeling of safety? Maybe you've avoided a conversation because you didn't want to hear the answer. Maybe you agreed to something you didn't actually agree with. Maybe you became defensive because someone challenged your thinking. Maybe you micromanaged because uncertainty made you feel uncomfortable. Maybe you pivoted because waiting for more information felt unbearable. Maybe you stayed quiet because visibility felt risky. Maybe you fought a battle that didn't need to be won. And now I want you to ask, what did that safety actually cost me? Did it cost relational capital, your credibility, trust, information, confidence, presence? Did I protect myself from 10 minutes of discomfort while creating 3 months of consequences? That's the leverage question. And then run the rest of the diagnostic. Am I acting to protect what I built or to expand where I'm going? If people I lead or serve watched how I handled that moment, would it increase their trust in my character? Does fighting this battle increase my future options or my burning relational capital just to win right now? Is this signal telling me something genuinely needs to change, or is simply the noise of my ego being bruised? And finally, as my friend Ryan Leake likes to ask, what's it like to be on the other side of me? This is incredibly powerful because it moves us from intention to impact. Maybe you intended to protect the business, but what did everyone else experience? Maybe you intended to demonstrate accountability, but did they experience control? Maybe you intended to establish authority, but did they experience defensiveness? Maybe you intended to solve the problem, but did the person sitting across from you at dinner experience your absence. That's the character audit. There's an important caveat here. Not every uncomfortable situation should be reframed as, this is just my ego, I need to stay. Sometimes the environment is wrong. Sometimes the strategy isn't working. Sometimes the relationship is destructive. Sometimes leaving is the courageous choice. The distinction I look for is what the discomfort is producing. Growth discomfort expands you. Survival pressure consumes you. Growth can still be uncomfortable. You can be nervous, embarrassed, uncertain, disappointed, but somewhere inside the experience, you're becoming more capable. You're embracing the journey. Self destructive pressure is different. It becomes judgment. I'm not enough. I'm a fraud. I should have known I can't do this. You are no longer examining the experience. You're prosecuting yourself. And prosecution isn't reflection. There's no curiosity in prosecution. The verdict has already been decided. This is ultimately where I want to leave this. When we're under pressure, survival asks, how do I make this uncomfortable feeling go away? Thriving asks, what can this experience give me that I get to carry forward? And that's what leverage means to me. Not power, not winning, not always being right. Leverage is what you leave the experience with: a new tool, a different perspective, a stronger boundary, a better question, a capability you didn't have before, a different way of framing adversity. The podcast problem gave me one. Next time something like this happens, I want exactly what I'm practicing here: freezing the instinct to solve, going to the source, asking for help, and remembering that a problem can matter without becoming my entire world. That's growth. That's leverage. And that's the difference between simply surviving an experience and allowing it to expand you. So the next time you feel yourself spiraling, fighting, withdrawing, overworking, avoiding, or desperately trying to regain control, I want you to and immediately think, how do I fix this? I want you to start somewhere else. What do I think is being threatened? Is it my income, my authority, my reputation, my credibility, my control, my identity? And then, am I threat stacking? What actually happened? And what additional threats have I attached to it? Then, what value am I negotiating with the danger of being threatened? Curiosity, objectivity, humility, integrity, empathy, courage, accountability, and then run your pattern interrupter. If you're certain, get curious. If you're catastrophizing, get objective. If you're protecting your ego, practice humility. And finally, who do I want to be on the other side of this experience? Because maybe that's the real difference between surviving and thriving. Survival is trying to return to who you were before the disruption. Thriving is allowing the disruption to expand who you are afterward. And if you're tired of your survival instincts making your decisions for you, subscribe and join me here in the laboratory every week. We're not just talking about leadership, we're examining and practicing the character shifts required to stay leveraged when the pressure's on. Because your character isn't proven by never spiraling. It isn't proven by never being scared. And it certainly isn't proven by never making mistakes. Your character is built every time pressure gives you an opportunity to abandon your values, and you learn how to access them anyway. That's the work, not becoming someone who never enters survival mode. Becoming someone who recognizes it sooner, who restores perspective faster, who understands that asking for help doesn't diminish power, who doesn't confuse discomfort with danger, and who leaves the experience with more capacity than they had going in. Because pressure doesn't have to reduce you to survival. It can become the laboratory where you learn how to thrive. If you're looking to work one-on-one and tackle your demons of your high achieving spirit, reach out to me for an exploratory call where we can discuss some of your current challenges in greater depth and give you the tools that you need to thrive further. Thanks for joining today and have a great rest of your week.